In 2021, Squid Game became one of the biggest shows in Netflix history. Around the world, viewers watched a brutal thriller. In Korea, the same show was something else, a documentary about their own childhood. To understand why, we have to go back, much further than 2021. Before we begin, one fact. Director Hwang Dong-hyuk wrote the first Squid Game script in 2009. For over a decade, no studio would make it. The reason was simple: too unrealistic. It took until 2021 for the world to find this story believable. The show didn't get more brutal, the times caught up to it. Today, we walk into the real Korean history, the history the show was waiting for. 1953, the Korean War ended. In the aftermath, Korea was one of the poorest countries on earth. Per capita income was around $80 a year. The 1970s were the decade Korea was just starting to rise from those ashes. Jobs were scarce, adults were too busy surviving. And in the back alleys, the kids built their own small economy. Pocket change, lunch money, they wagered it on marbles. Losing wasn't an accident. It was a rule. The marbles passed legally to another child. For the kid who lost, the system did nothing. Because that's how the adult world worked, too. Fast forward about 50 years, 2021. Netflix's Squid Game put adults through the exact same games from those back alleys. With one difference: lose and you actually die. Dalgona, a street snack from 1970s Korea, made with nothing but sugar and baking soda. After the show, people all over the world tried it on TikTok. Most of them failed. But Dalgona wasn't invented for Netflix. It was an everyday thing, sold by the Dalgona vendor in front of every school for 10 won. About 3 cents at the time, not enough to buy a loaf of bread. But for those kids, it was a small fortune. The rules were simple. Pull out the shape without breaking it, you get another one. Fail, both the candy and the 10 won went to the vendor. No rule gave the losing child half their money back. That's how the adult world worked, so that's how the games worked too. Next, marbles. In post-war Korea, marbles weren't toys. They were the currency of the children's world. The kids who won got rich. The ones who didn't went bankrupt. Some Koreans in their 60s and 70s today still remember it. Walking home with empty pockets on a cold autumn evening. The moment of not knowing what to tell their parents. This wasn't play. It was the forced transfer of resources. A legal system where the loser's assets passed to the winner. The kids in those alleys learned the logic of adult capitalism long before the adults ever sat them down to explain it.
무궁화 꽃이 피었습니다.
That phrase. Anyone who watched the show remembers it. Netflix translated it as red light, green light. But the subtitles couldn't carry one fact. This game originally came to Korea from Japan during the colonial occupation. Korean kids took the rule and overlaid it with the name of their own national flower, mugunghwa, the Rose of Sharon. Colonization and decolonization folded into a single line of song. And then there's how the game actually works. The crowd collectively points at whoever moved. That person is immediately removed. Under the name of a flower that means eternal, the group eliminates one of its own. That's the rule running quietly underneath. And tug-of-war? In 2015, UNESCO inscribed tugging rituals and games on the list of intangible cultural heritage. Here's the interesting part. It wasn't inscribed as Korean alone. Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, the Philippines. 4 rice-farming countries, jointly inscribed. In other words, tug-of-war isn't uniquely Korean. It was a collective ritual shared across the entire rice-farming world. In Korea, every first full moon of the lunar year, Villages split into east and west and pulled the rope. East wins, good harvest. West wins, famine. This wasn't a game, it was divination. A ritual that asked the community's collective strength to predict the village's year. The show simply translated that symbolic collective struggle into a modern slaughterhouse. And the game the show is named after, Squid Game, was something kids really played in parts of 1970s Korea. You draw a circle, a triangle, and a square on the ground, connected to form the shape of a squid. The attackers hop on one foot, trying to break through the defenders and reach the squid's head. The defenders, with both feet free, try to push the attackers out of bounds. Rough doesn't cover it. Torn clothes, scraped knees, bloody noses. They were normal. The rules were designed from the very start to push someone out and isolate them. Director Hwang says he played this game often as a kid and often lost. Then he adds one line. Losing Squid Game as a child felt like failing to survive in this society. If you had to summarize the entire show in one sentence, that's it. This is where Squid Game splits into two readings. The common reading, pure children's games corrupted by adult greed. But people who grew up in those Korean alleys see it differently. Korean games were teaching children one rule from the very beginning. Someone must lose, and the system will not save that person. The show didn't invent a new rule, it just turned up the volume on a rule that was always there. That's why, to Korean viewers, this wasn't a thriller. It was a record of something they had already lived. These brutal rules of the alley didn't just drop from the sky in the 1970s. Korea's legal caste system was abolished in the 1894 Gabo reform, but its skeleton survived like a ghost, haunting the alleys and ruling the children's games. To see where it came from, we have to go back nearly 500 years. From 1392 to 1894, for nearly 500 years, the Joseon dynasty ruled the Korean peninsula. It split society into four classes. One caveat, though, this system wasn't as completely closed as we often imagine. The thing scarier than the law was perception. At the top of the pyramid sat the Yangban, the ruling class that monopolized governance and scholarship and held the resources to access the Gwajyo, the civil service exam, which was the one ladder up. Beneath them, the Jongjin, specialists like doctors and interpreters. Below them, the commoners, farmers and merchants, the vast majority. At the bottom, the slaves and other outcasts. Here's the interesting fact. The exam was legally open to all commoners. On paper, the system claimed equality. But the money to buy books, the time to study, the tutors who could teach, those existed only in Yangban homes. The door said, open. The ladder was placed in only one kind of house. What does this caste system have to do with alleyway games? On the surface, the marble field looked equal. A Yangban's child and a slave's child faced off on the same dirt under the same rules. But that equality was surface only. One child was well-fed, his hands steady, free to practice all day because nobody made him work. The other helped with labor before dawn, before he could even touch a marble. They weren't standing on the same starting line. They were running toward the same finish line from completely different starts. The playing field was never level, not once. Squid Game has layers that only come into focus through Korean language and Korean society. First, the prize money, 45.6 billion won. It looks like one giant number, but look closer. 456 players, 45.6 billion won. That's exactly 100 million won per person. Every life carries the same price tag. And here's the cruel part. Each time a player dies, the prize goes up by exactly that amount, and it drops into a giant piggy bank on the ceiling where everyone can watch it grow. Your rivals' deaths become your money in real time, but the game is built so that money can never be shared. There is no version where everyone walks home a little richer. Someone must end up with all of it, which means everyone else must be gone. That's not a thriller invention. That's the same rule the alley games taught. Squid Game just gave that rule a price tag. Second, player 001, Oh Il-nam. For Korean viewers, he wasn't a plot twist. He was the archetype of a hierarchy that exists in real Korean life. Korean has a word for it: gap, spelled G-A-P. The Korean gap comes from the Chinese character for first. It refers to whoever holds the upper hand in any relationship: the employer, the landlord, the system itself. The other side is Yul, the one beneath the gap. And in Korea, gap becomes a verb: gapjil. The act of weaponizing your gap status to humiliate the Yul beneath you. English has no precise word for this. Korean does, which tells you how routine it is. Oh Il-nam took it one step further. He didn't just watch from above. He came down into the game himself and consumed their suffering as entertainment. For Korean viewers, he was a face they already knew. Third, the masks the workers wear: circle, triangle, square. Director Hwang has stated what each one means. Circle is the laborer. Triangle is the armed guard. Square is the manager. The show's class structure compressed into 3 shapes, but if you can read Hangul, another layer opens up. The team has said these shapes echo 3 Korean letters: E-Young, Ji-Yut, Mi-Yum, the building blocks behind Ojingo, the Korean word for squid. Not a perfect spelling, but a design woven from the language itself. One mask carrying class and tongue at the same time. Korean folk belief sometimes reads these 3 shapes as Chonji-in, heaven, earth, and human. That, however, is not the director's official explanation. Fourth, the ending. When Seong Gi-hun refuses to board the plane to America and turns around, this scene reads on 2 levels. The surface reading, the beginning of a revenge story. That's a fair read. But seen through Korean family narrative, a different weight emerges. In Korean storytelling, the strongest moral claim is family, especially one's child. It is rare for the protagonist to turn away from his own kid. So when Gi-hun gives up the flight to his daughter, for Korean viewers, it reads like this: his anger came before his child. That is a deeply un-Korean decision, and the fact that Korean audiences accepted it, that might be the real signal of change. Before we close, one fact check. The household debt crisis Squid Game depicts is real. Korea's household debt to GDP ratio is one of the highest in the developed world. But the reading that foreign VIPs are secretly running Korea's economy, that's not what the show is showing. The VIPs aren't the operators. They came to bet. They're spectators. Real inequality isn't a conspiracy. Conspiracies are cinematic. They give you a clear villain. Real life is more boring. Tax codes, financial products, asset prices, legal loopholes. But here's the truth we shouldn't ignore. That boring system isn't neutral. It stays tilted under the name of the law toward the gap, the ones already holding the upper hand. The show compressed that vast legalized imbalance into masked figures you could see. Every game has rules. The real question isn't what the rules are. The real question is, who wrote them? The 456 contestants thought they had simply been unlucky. But the place they walked into wasn't a game of luck. It was a game of class. Koreans first learned this in the alleys of Joseon 600 years ago. They learned it again in the alleys of the 1970s. They confirmed it once more in 2021, watching Squid Game, not as a thriller, but as a documentary of their own lives. The world watched the show for the first time that year, but by then, similar things were already starting in everyone else's alleys too. Korea may have just arrived first. Next, a story about zombies. More precisely, a story that isn't about zombies. In 1670, Joseon faced a disaster that turned people into something not quite human anymore. Hunger, the period that inspired Netflix's Kingdom. Hundreds of thousands starved to death. By some estimates, close to 1 million. The royal annals recorded it, line by line. We'll come back with the real record of the 1670 Gyeongsin Great Famine, more brutal than any zombie. If today's story interested you, hit subscribe. We'll keep bringing the real Korean histories that don't usually get told. This was K-Untold.